ASEAN agenda should support this
The Ukraine war changed everything. We have a pre-Ukraine war and we have a post-Ukraine war geopolitical environment. And the geopolitical role of Europe of the European Union has changed after Ukraine. The issue of credibility of the EU is its capacity to be a credible actor on the whole spectrum of geopolitics. So be it at its borders with Ukraine, but also in the Indo-Pacific. And this comes linked to the values and the interest that the EU has to defend. When we see a big, powerful neighbor invading, provoking a war with no reasons on a smaller and a less powerful country, well, we all have to stand up and consider that this constitutes a very dramatic breach of international order, a breach of the UN Charter, a breach of all the values on which we found our living together and our way of solving disputes in a peaceful way. And all the countries which have signed the UN Charter have to respect this principle of solving conflicts without arms. Having said that, what is happening nowadays at the borders of the EU reinforces even more the EU to act in the Indo-Pacific. In the Indo-Pacific, we are projecting ourselves not only as the biggest economic and trade bloc of the world, but we are also projecting ourselves as the major development actor, as well as an interest in defending a free and open Indo-Pacific, also through enhancing our defense presence, our security engagement. So it is the EU which has to project itself in all of its capacities. The EU has already decided back in September, when we have published the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific, to step up its presence in terms of defense and security. So it's of course a necessary link to the protection of our interests, the fact that we have to reinforce as well the visibility of the military in the region. But of course, we all have to bear in mind that the EU does not have an army of its own, does not have a navy of its own, and does not have an air force of its own. So all the military capabilities that the EU might have and deploy depend on the willingness of the member states. And this is a very important thing to say. The EU already has a military naval presence in the Indian Ocean, which is EUNAVFOR Atalanta, which has already cooperated through joint exercises, for example, with local navies of the Indo-Pacific. So I name Japan, Korea, and India, for example. So, but we are really looking forward at strengthening this kind of work even more. We have also, on the 21st of February, decided to launch a new initiative in the field of defense, which is called Coordinated Maritime Presence in the Indian Ocean. It's a new concept under the Common Security and Defense Policy of the EU. Basically, it's about having one or more EU vessels passing through zone of the ocean, which is called a zone of maritime interest of the EU. And then this vessel decides to share the data that it collects through its passage in this part with the EU military headquarters. So this becomes a way of real-time, let's say, information of what is happening. And this is, in our view, a way to ensure that the EU is kept informed of what's happening in real time in the zones of maritime interest. I would like here simply to underline that the 40% of the global trade towards the EU comes from the Indo-Pacific. So this already makes you understand how vital is that we secure the sea lanes of communication from the Indo-Pacific to the EU. And just as an example, it was not due to any kind of military coercion or terrorism, but you remember this summer when one container ship turned away in the Suez Channel, then Europe was cut off from the Indo-Pacific for 10 days, and this had problems for the overall industrial sector of the EU. So even Lithuania suffered because one ship made a wrong maneuver in the Canal of Suez. So can you imagine if we have real issues in the Indo-Pacific, what that would mean for the Europe? We engage with China. We keep the channel open. We discuss openly. We have all the possible means of communication and interaction, from working level in terms of civil servants up to the summit of the heads of state. And here I would like to stress that on April the 1st, there will be a summit with Xi Jinping and the President of the Commission, the President of the Council. So with China, we have to have relations. And the EU has a prism against which it enjoys these relations with China. It's tripartite. We engage with China as a partner on issues of common interest and where we can have solutions if we work jointly. And the clearest example of this is the cooperation on climate change. China has been a very good ally to our views on the climate change and the fight against climate change. And so the results of COP26 back in Edinburgh were also due to the fact that China was siding with us on the fight against carbon. We engage with China also as a competitor, as an economic competitor, of course. And on this, there are no issues in having competition, but the competition has to be fair, and all the competitors have to follow the rules. We have an issue when the rules are not followed. Finally, and that's the third aspect in which we engage with China, it is as a systemic rival. There are parts of the issues we discuss that are not negotiable, and where the EU simply pushes back. And we are talking about human rights, we talk about the rule of law, or other values which are non-negotiable in our views. And this also led, for example, to sanctions imposed by the EU on Chinese entities. But this also meant a retaliation of China towards the EU in sanctioning also members of the European Parliament or even ambassadors of the EU in Brussels. So, having said that, what is happening now in Ukraine casts an additional element for our relations with China. And basically, it is the potential role that China could have through its close ties, let's call it, with Russia. High Representative Borrell publicly called for China to exert possibly its influence over Russia to first achieve a ceasefire, and secondly, to respect the humanitarian corridors in real terms. So I think that here we have to bear in mind what the current situation is, which demands an immediate crisis management mood, which should lead us as soon as possible to the cessation of the fights. Then we will see the rest. But really, the ceasefire and the guarantee of the humanitarian corridors are the paramount priorities for everybody. And we consider that China might have a role to play in this. Too soon to say. I will revert your question in saying that we are for sure in an international disorder. Now, let's see if we achieve a new international order, that's sure. But there will definitely be a pre-Ukraine and a post-Ukraine order and ways of understanding the global relations in the world, for that for sure. I would really underline the fact that in these days, what we are seeing is that the Western world, in terms of democracies and Western values, have been challenged. But the answer has been united and strong. And the credibility of democracies in the eyes also of the outer world depends on their capacities to stand up united and answer credibly. And we have done that. So I am pretty confident that in the future we will continue to be strong and united. And upon this ability, the credibility of the democratic system will rely.